Okay, we'll just wait for a minute or two and then let's start in 3-2. Yeah. Okay, I think we should get started now. So thank you everybody for joining for today's knowledge session. This is the second knowledge session for round one for YLAC Social Incubator. And the YLAC Social Action Incubator is an opportunity for students to address urgent social problems in their schools and communities. It is a pan-India competition where participating teams will go through various rounds of shortlisting, and the top 3 teams will receive funding and mentorship for the execution of their idea. In this academic year 22-23, we successfully launched the incubator competition in partnership with our Equality Clubs program. And after an overwhelming response from our Equality Club students, we have opened this competition to schools across the country. Today, we're having the second knowledge session for round one of the incubator, and we have Brinda and Nidhi from Aaina to lead the session on diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining. I'll briefly introduce Aaina and then over to both of you. Aaina is an initiative to help encourage critical reflection on educational experience among students and other stakeholders. Sorry, I think I was stuck for a second. And anybody else also engaged with the question of education. Aaina develops resources that explore how learning is linked to the question of society, history, and culture. And through their informational content on social media platforms, primarily Instagram, they share research-based perspectives on education and document the experiences of students and teachers. Aaina's aim is to build conversations on how education can be reimagined as empowering and transformative for all and not just a privileged few. Today, we have Brinda, who's a founder at Aaina, and Nidhi, who's a member at Aaina, with us to lead the session. Over to both of you.
Thanks for that introduction, Shubhra. Hi, everyone. Really great to see everyone, and thank you for joining our session on diversity and inclusion. Like Shubhra helpfully already introduced us, I'm Nidhi, and I also have with me Vrinda. We are from Aaina. Can we go to the next slide? We'll just briefly again introduce Aaina. Aaina is an initiative to encourage students, teachers, everyone else to reflect on educational experience. And we do this through comics, like Shubhra already mentioned. Before we begin the session, I would also like to request everyone to maybe keep a book and a pen handy. We'll have different opportunities for you to just jot down your thoughts, your perspectives, and any questions that you may have along the way so that we can address them towards the end of the session. So I'll just give you a minute to do that. And also we encourage you to discuss things with each other on the chat. So, this is a great opportunity for you to also talk to other students across the country who may be attending this session with you. So I'll just give you a moment's pause for you to, if you don't have a book and a pen around you, just quickly grab one. All right, so I hope everyone has something to just scribble on now. Let's start actually with a word association game. The question, you will have 2 questions that you will need to answer. The first is, what is the first word or phrase that comes to your mind when you think of diversity? Now, the way that you can submit your responses is you can either scan this QR code if you have a phone with you, or you can also go to menti.com and type the code that's appearing on your screen, 32468672, and then you will get a box where you can type in your words. The key to this is not to think too much, just whatever first comes to your mind, just enter that and click next. I'll give you again about 5-10 seconds to do this.
Nidhi, if we can go to the Menti page and ensure that it is now open.
Sure.
Thank you.
Shubhra, could you check if it's working? I'll just display the QR code again.
Sure.
1 second.
No issues.
Meanwhile, you can also feel free to put in your responses on the chat if it's difficult to access Menti or if you don't have another device on at the moment. You know, we're happy to also just go through the chat as well.
Hi, Brenda. I think you will have to open your presentation because right now it's showing is closed. So maybe you can try doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, 1 second. I'll just do that. I realized can't share 2 presentations at once, so I'll just figure that out. 1 second.
No worries at all.
Yeah, now it should be functioning. Yeah.
Yes, it does open now.
Yeah. So after a minute, we can move on to the next question.
Next question. Yeah.
And since Vrinda, it's open now, we can also screen share it so anybody
Okay,
else
yeah.
who's joined now. will
Yeah,
be able
makes sense. Yeah, I'll just do that.
Thank you.
Just to remind you, the first question is, what is the first word or phrase that comes to your mind when you think of diversity?
I'm sharing the code and the link and the QR code again. Will it also be possible to paste this link on chat? If yeah.
Right. If we have a few responses, can we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. The second question is very similar. What is the first word or phrase that comes to your mind when you think of inclusion? You don't need a separate Menti for this. Once you click enter on the same Menti, it will show you the second question and you can respond. Can we share the word cloud? Let's look at what everyone thinks.
Can we do it after enough people have responded for the second
Sure.
one also? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see responses for the second one right now. So
Okay. We'll give another moment.
Also just sharing that after you submit for the first word, you might see a notification on top, go to next slide. Once you click on that, the responses will come in for the second word.
okay.
So please take a moment to look at your screen. If you're still seeing diversity, all your responses for inclusion are coming into that. Go to the next slide and send in your responses for inclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have some responses for both, and I'll just share screen so we can look at them. Yeah.
Oh, wow, amazing.
Yeah.
So we can see that, a lot of people associate diversity with variety, with equality, being yourself, different kinds of people living together, plurality, which is quite interesting, right? Vrinda, do you have any observations you'd like to share?
Yeah, I see that the words like democracy, integration,
Hmm.
India, interestingly. So there are things we already associate, like things that exist, and we associate them with diversity. So it can be
Hmm.
systems, it can be countries, and yeah.
Yeah.
Um, should,
And we see that we all kind of agree that diversity is a good thing, right? Because, it means that different kinds of people are coexisting. Actually, it would be quite boring if everywhere we went, we only came across people who are just like us. So it kind of benefits us, it benefits other people. It's good overall to have diversity around us. So yeah, that's great. Can we move to the next slide and see what people think of inclusion?
yeah.
Great. Friendliness, no discrimination. Again, being you everywhere. Enthusiastic acceptance. That's interesting, right? It's not just kind of begrudging
Hmm.
acceptance, like, "Theek you're also there," but like an actual enthusiastic acceptance. Vrinda, any
There's also
thoughts?
like interesting things like equal access or
Hmm.
belonging or no discrimination. So yeah, it's like we know that like discrimination is in some ways in opposition to what we think of as inclusion, and these are some
Absolutely.
of the threads we'll be taking forward from. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also it begs a lot of questions like, is no discrimination equal to inclusion? Is there something more? So these are things that we can explore. In this session, we will be doing exactly that. We will look at what does inclusion mean? What does diversity mean? How do we typically understand it? But how can we also nuance our ideas, further our thought on this? We'll also look at how exclusion plays out, and since we primarily work on education, we will be taking a lot of examples from education, but you can, along the way, think about other spaces where similar things happen or similar things work. So you can think of workplaces, you can think of neighborhoods, you can think of public spaces, right? Or transportation, any space that you access regularly. And you can keep, also discussing and bringing up those examples in the chat with each other. So once we do that, we'll also sort of look at how do we apply our understanding of inclusion and exclusion if we want to create a project like a lot of you will be doing as part of the incubator, right? All right, so let's move to the next part. When we talk about diversity, if we can go to the next slide. Great, thanks, Vrinda. All right, so we looked at a couple of associations we have with diversity, but how do we really define it, right? So here on this slide, you can see that two students have somewhat different notions of what diversity means. The first student is saying that students in my university come from more than 10 states across India. They study different disciplines from physics to history, and they all have varying interests and opinions, and that's what makes them diverse. The second student has a little bit of a different understanding of diversity. She is pointing out that in my school, not everyone has the same income level. They belong to different caste communities and they come from various districts in Maharashtra, which is the same state, but different districts across there. So let's take a moment to jot ideas in our notebook about what we think the difference between these two understandings of diversity is, which one have we heard more around us being used, and yeah, anything else that you might be able to understand about the various ways in which the word diversity is used around us. I'll just pause for a second so you can just think a little bit about this. Feel free to drop ideas in the chat. Okay, so something that I can see very clearly as the difference between the two notions of diversity here is that One is a little broader in that it's looking at geographical diversity, it's looking at different disciplines, different interests and opinions. So it's looking at difference in general, right? In the second one, it's a little more specific because, we can imagine that even if students in the first university come from different states, their income level actually may be similar, even though they live in different places. So in a way, we can see that the second student is adding a little bit that is missing in the first definition of diversity, right? Similarly, even though students come from the same state in her school, which is Maharashtra, there is still different kinds of diversity like income level, caste, and so on. So we can see that even when people come from different states, they could be coming from the same position in a particular hierarchy, or they can come from similar geographical regions, or they can have similar opinions, but differ in the sense of gender, in the sense of caste, in the sense of what religion they belong to, communities and identities, right? So that is one difference I can see. The other difference I can see is that the first definition of diversity is quite celebratory and positive, right? She's saying that, oh my God, it's so great. We all think differently. We are studying different disciplines, so it's quite interdisciplinary. We come from different places, so we kind of get to exchange maybe ideas and cultures. So it's a very positive expression of diversity, right? But in the second one, we can see that that is being a little bit complicated because diversity can also mean that there are inequalities at play. It can also mean that power is moving in a certain way, power is working in a certain way. And in her school, maybe diversity is not something to always be celebrated because it signals that we are not all equal. It could be creating certain tensions, certain difficult interactions where, these inequalities are advantageous to some. So maybe students who come from richer backgrounds, they might find certain things easier in the school. And it can be negative for others, right? Diversity or inequality can be negative for others. So what do we get from this, right? It's not that either of these ideas of diversity is wrong, right? Both are using the word diversity in different ways and in valid ways. But what we need to do now when we think about inclusion is, because power exists, we need to find a way to bring these two definitions together. So not just looking at the first kind of diversity, because it's a word that's used a lot in different kinds of spaces and it's almost become a very popular word to use, right? So what we need to do when we think of inclusion is not just to think about opinions of states and things like that, but also the complexities and the difficulties, the challenges, the contradictions that might be involved in thinking about diversity. So we need to bring these two definitions together. And because, like I said, power exists, we also need to think about inclusion. One thing to kind of remember here is that a lot of spaces that we access right now may not be diverse in the second sense, even when they are diverse in the first sense, right? But what we will also try to think about in this session is, okay, let's say that there are spaces, for example, schools, universities, workplaces, public spaces, where we do have a little bit of diversity in the second sense, in that people are not coming from the same class, people are of different genders, people come from various districts, etc., etc. What happens then, right? How does inequality affect diversity? So if we can move to the next slide, we can see a very important question we'll try to explore. How does diversity play out when there is inequality? So here we'll consider spaces where there is some amount of diversity, but there is also inequality. So we'll do this by exploring some of the posts and some scenes from posts we have made in Aaina based on research, based on conversations with other people. And I'll now hand it over to Vrinda to take you through the first couple of posts.
Thanks, Nidhi. So, Nidhi has already introduced what we are going to do in this workshop. So, now there'll be broadly two sections to this. In the first section, both Nidhi and I will walk you through different Aaina posts, which are sort of situated in different settings, where this sort of inequality plays out, or which allows us to think of what meaningful inclusion would look like. What are the limitations to that first kind of diversity that we talked about? So I'll start with a couple of posts, then Nidhi will do some, and in the final section, we will also try to think about how we can apply whatever we have learned to the kind of projects that you all will be taking on in the incubator. So yeah, these are two slides from a post. I'll first read through it and then give you 30 seconds or so to jot down your thoughts on it, and then point out what we were trying to show and how this helps in the kind of conversation around inclusion we are trying to build through this session. So this post is titled Implementing Initiatives to Encourage Transgender, Gender Non-Conforming and Non-Binary Students Admissions. So transgender students are those who, like transgender individuals are those who don't identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth. And recently, there have been policies that have tried to include them in educational institutions. So, in the first slide, we see a principal or a head of an institute, probably a dean of a college or someone who's saying on a podium. So, this is an announcement. Following the recent guidelines, we are welcoming transgender students into our courses this year. Our admission forms too will have a third gender option, and we will sensitize all teachers. The question we are asking is what is missing. So one slide we show that points towards what is missing is requirements are not discrimination free. So this one student is asking another, what happened? Did your application to BA get accepted? The second student is saying they said they can't process it because the name on my ID proof and my 12th certificate don't match. I tried to explain, but they just wouldn't listen. They know nothing about us. So take 30 seconds or so to think about or note down what sort of concerns we are trying to show here, even when there is inclusion at one level. What are we trying to talk about here? Yeah. So one thing that we want to point to is that, okay, so for inclusion of transgender individuals, often the first idea that comes to mind is this option on a form that is not male or female, right? So another option, and in the first case, the principal is saying that they'll have a gender option and they will sensitize all teachers. So I want to bring your attention to the question of sensitizing all teachers, which will also link to the next slide, which is that teachers are not the only people that compose an institution, right? So, an institution is made up of different individuals, different positions and identities, and teachers are one of them, of course, but if such a provision is implemented, but say the ground level staff, so this is administrative staff, this is people who actually do the admissions by paper, if they are not sensitized, it can create a lot of challenges and like harm for transgender students who are entering. So a problem like this is what we see in the second slide. So even when there is token at the inclusion, like a token inclusion at the level of admissions, the requirements or the procedures that a student is expected to go through, they are not discrimination free. So one common issue that a lot of transgender individuals face is that the legal bureaucratic processes for changing their name or gender on documents is actually quite tedious and tiresome and not easy at all. And this is the struggle they're facing in this institution also, even though a provision for their admission has been made. So the point we want to make through this is that when we think of inclusion, we have to think of it at multiple levels. This will be institutional, this will be social, this will be procedural. This will also include changes that have to be made at the level of infrastructure, at the level of teaching learning in the classroom at different levels. So that's how we want to complicate the understanding of inclusion when there is so much inequality. For the next slide, we are looking at another set of like individuals, which is like disabled students, right? And once again, the mainstream conversation on inclusion of disabled students often includes conversation on accessible infrastructure, right? So here we talk about ramps that ramps that can be accessed by students. We talk about tactile paths. But in this post, what we tried to talk about was how do we address the social and emotional needs of disabled students. So these are not just physical infrastructural needs, but one step beyond, and how we think of it in a more layered way. So in the first slide, we see this student who's very maybe kindly, supportively asking this other student, "Hey, do you need any help? I can drop you till your hostel." And the student is thinking, no, the student says, "No, I can manage, thanks." But at the same time, she's thinking, "I wish she saw me more than just a blind person who needs help, but someone she could get to know, maybe go on a date with." In the second slide, we are showing a peer group setting in a college. And here, the group of students were talking, the weather's suddenly great, let's bunk the talk and hang out at the canteen stairs. And the other person enthusiastically responds, "Yeah, yes, let's." And then there's a student who's on a wheelchair and is thinking, how are they expecting me to go? Or are they not thinking of me at all? So once again, I'd like you to take a few seconds, like 25-30 seconds, to just note down what you think is happening in this slide or what the challenge here exactly is. Yeah. So in the like in the first slide, there's nothing wrong with what the student is asking, right? Like asking another student if they need help to be dropped to the hostel is a nice thing to do, is a thing we want to encourage. But even when someone is being supportive, what we need to think of is how we can complicate our understanding of someone else's need. So sure, like this is a need, but at the same time, how like we need to think of how we might potentially be reducing a disabled student to only their disability. So we are looking at them in a so the student might be looking at her in a very limited way, so in a slotted way, where all they think of when they see this is their disability based needs, not needs that everyone else also has, needs of friendship, relationship, etc. And so it's important to be supportive, but we have to think of how there's a risk of compromising the other person's dignity in this context. And similarly, like there are these invisible barriers that might be guiding such a conversation, right? So like it's like you're not interacting with them as fully, or like there's a very there's a limitation to how the conversation is happening. In the second slide, what the kind of need we are showing is actually one of infrastructure in leisure spaces also. So very commonly when infrastructure is spoken about in universities or schools or different institutions, actually the priority is making academic areas or the more necessary places accessible. But a huge part of educational spaces, of learning, of bonding, these places is where we hang out, right? And like stairs are super common in this context. And the fact that the student doesn't, we want to point out how the student doesn't have access to the infrastructure in leisure spaces. But the other thing we also want to point out is this possible invisible kind of inconsideration, right? The student is not being mean by not asking, but they're really they're not sensitized enough to think of how to include this student who's on a wheelchair in their everyday day-to-day hanging out contexts also. So yeah, that's all I want to say about these two posts. And now Nidhi will continue. Oh, sorry. One
Great.
second. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let's look at another post, the next post, where we look at certain class inequalities and how class inequalities may be affecting students' experiences. So here we can see a post, how financial stress at home shapes emotions around education. And the first slide titled Straining Social Relationships. You see two students, and the first student says, "Hi, are you free tomorrow evening? I'm calling some people over." And the second student is looking a bit unsure and is thinking, "I'd love to go, but she might expect me to invite her too. And with the home situation, it's impossible, and so many people wouldn't even fit." In the second slide, being used to poor treatment and seen as a social inferior, one student tells the other student, so presumably the context is that a professor has treated the second student not very well. She says, "Why didn't you say something? He has no business speaking to you like that. It's totally out of line for a professor." And the second student says, "Really?" And thinks, "But people have spoken to me like this my entire life." So I'll give you, again, a few seconds, a little bit of time to think about what's going on here and what that implies for the project of inclusion. You can note it down. You can also put it on the chat. Okay, I hope you've had a chance to jot down some points, some reflections. So here, once again, we see that there is an effort, right? There's an effort to include, there's an effort to build connection between one student and the other student, right? However, because of the inequality that's present in this space, there is an emotional consequence that the more disadvantaged student, possibly coming from a lower class, maybe has lower income, or their home spaces are kind of structured differently. So the inequality is creating an emotional experience and a certain kind of anxiety for the more disadvantaged student in this situation. And we can think of this outside of academic spaces also, right? In our friendships, in, spaces where we are learning a hobby, things like that. But the thing is that, we might say that, okay, like the first person is doing something nice. Again, it's not always possible for us to expect or anticipate how someone else is going to feel. But there are two reasons why being aware of something like this is important, right? One is that it's important to, as an exercise in empathy, and to kind of try to understand how there might be things going on in another person's life, or challenges around the choices that they make on an everyday basis that are invisible to us, right? And so when we think of making a project where we want to include, we can start thinking about, okay, what are the various challenges that people might be experiencing without sort of assuming that they are. So that's one reason. And the second reason is that, yeah, I mean, it's not possible for this first student to always fix, or an individual student or a couple of students to always kind of look for this inequality, and always, while we should try, always resolve certain anxieties or certain tensions or dynamics that might emerge. So here, it might be useful for us to think of other kinds of solutions. So for example, institutional solutions, right? What can the school do? What can the college do in this situation to ease the process of forming social relationships outside of your own class? Outside of people who are similar to you in many ways, right? So maybe the college can or school can host certain events, right, where some basic amenities are already provided for, and people can get to know each other, right? In a lot of school contexts, we also, to give another example, talk about uniforms, right, as things that are in place so that there is no discrimination based on how people dress and what they can afford. Similarly, in a lot of higher education spaces, sometimes we think that giving a scholarship is enough in terms of bringing people who may not be able to afford a certain kind of education into the college. But what about once they enter, right? What about leisure, which is very important as a learning space also? So maybe making a stipend available so that they can not only afford other additional educational resources like journals and books and things like that, textbooks, but also move about with their friends, create social relationships, not feel isolated on any kind of institutional place, right? So those are some solutions we can think of on an institutional level. Now, in the second slide, we can also see a different kind of emotional consequence that's happening for the more disadvantaged student, which is that being treated badly has become such a normalized part of their life that it's no longer a surprise, and they may not feel in some situations where, of course, a lot of people are assertive, can be assertive, but in a lot of spaces, it's difficult because, you can't just say anything to a professor, for example. There are hierarchies involved. So it's not always possible to be able to demand that kind of respect, which again compromises dignity, compromises respect, equality, and values like that. So in these situations, we can also expect another thing to happen, which is self-exclusion. Or, maybe the student in the first slide just says, you know what, I don't want to deal with all of this. Let me just not go. So there's this kind of withdrawing that happens that's very difficult to, then it's very difficult to think about inclusion, right? When situations are happening in a way that the person feels compelled to withdraw. So that's also something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about inclusion. So thinking about inclusion is not just thinking about infrastructure, thinking about various levels, but also about the emotional effects of inequality and what we can do to find ways to talk about them together, solve them together, create spaces where it's comfortable to talk about how things have affected us, and then work out solutions for them. So that's the first post. Let's move on to the next one. Which is called Included but Excluded. And you can see the first slide marked and segmented. The context here is that there's a hostel allotment list, and you can see a list of names, and some names have a star marked against them. And there are two students looking at this list, and the first one is thinking, Deepa is scheduled caste. My parents would have a problem with her as a roommate. And the second student is thinking, why do they have to put a mark against our names? In the second slide, reading reservation as unearned privilege, one student asks two other students, my fellowship money or my scholarship money has not come for 6 months. Who can I speak to? The second student is responding, no idea, but is thinking, another quota type getting a scholarship for doing nothing. We had to work so hard. And the third student is thinking, why is she acting like she's hard up? She's clearly straightened her hair and got her nails done. So let's think a little bit about these caste inequalities now, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to jot down what you think is happening here, what kinds of challenges to inclusion are taking place. All right. So I hope you've had a chance to just reflect on these situations a little bit. The first thing we wanted to show through this post is that, a lot of research, a lot of instances around us show us that caste in a way in the mainstream is a bit different from all the examples we've seen so far. For example, class, disability, gender. In the previous instances, there is some common understanding and consensus in society that there are certain inequalities affecting people and that there is a need for inclusion, and we can empathize with the other people on the challenges that particular kind of marginalization or exclusion brings. But with respect to caste, there is still a lot of hostility, because we don't understand how caste works. That's one reason. The second reason is that there's a lot of segregation. So we don't often get to interact with people from other castes. So all of that plays out when you finally enter a space where there is that minimum kind of diversity, right? So for example, we see in the first slide that there is an attempt to include. The context for the slide is that a lot of institutions are mandated to reserve some amount of housing for students of marginalized backgrounds, keeping in mind that for scheduled caste students, scheduled tribe students, even women in a lot of cases, affordable housing is very difficult to find, especially when they move from their hometown to study. So keeping that in mind, the institution has followed this mandate, and they might be thinking, the institution or the principal or whoever it is, might be thinking that, okay, by putting a star against these names, we're making it clear that we are following the mandate. But in reality, it's having a very dangerous consequence for students, right? Because there is a stigma, because there is discriminatory attitudes, labeling a student as scheduled caste makes this information public, and you are making the student vulnerable then to discrimination, to harassment, to isolation, and all other kinds of inequalities and the way that inequalities can affect people. So you can see that there's a very clear foresight that is missing, right? You can think that, okay, this is a good thing to do to make this public, but what are the unintended consequences that our efforts can have? That's important to think about. In the second slide, we can also see that because we don't understand, because the students here don't understand how caste works, these things are not talked about often, there are certain rigid ideas of what scheduled caste students look like, what they wear, how they behave, what they buy. So whenever we come across someone who challenges these stereotypes or maybe doesn't entirely adhere to them, they don't fit in our boxes that we have made up, these students are not able to wrap their minds around them, and they're getting suspicious of this student, right? And this boy, for example, in this situation is assuming that anybody who is SC has to look sad, deprived, suffering. They cannot, sort of have straightened hair or got their nails done or, sort of engage in these kinds of activities. So as a result, he's also doubting the right and thinking of reservation as some kind of stolen seat, which is a very popular idea. But the seats actually don't belong to anybody, right? And what we call merit, which is a very popular notion again, is actually a product of a lot of factors growing up. So what kinds of schools we have access to, how sometimes, your class location and your class location can overlap, in that a lot of people who are poor do come from marginalized caste backgrounds. Whether we had access to tuitions, what kinds of family networks we had. So if our families were powerful and could give us the kind of guidance we need, a lot of these things, research has shown time and again that it depends on which caste we belong to. And sometimes these are not just things that happen in our life, right? These are things that we may not even know of that have affected our parents' lives, our grandparents' lives, and so on. So let's look at an example very quickly of how these benefits can be passed on from generation to generation. So for example, in this post, we have someone who's a very successful CEO and has international acclaim. He's talking about how, he was able to be successful because he loved learning and he was taught the value of hard work and discipline. And all of those are true things. They do contribute to how much success we have or how knowledgeable we are. But thinking from an inclusion standpoint, maybe it's also important to look at, okay, what other things could have also helped him. So if we look at his father's life, again, all of this is based on research on, how your caste location determines how likely your family is to own land, for example. How early your ancestors were able to move from the village to the city and transition into modern occupations like teaching and science and engineering, right? Instead of traditional occupations. How likely we are to get professional training, and how these benefits can be passed on from generation to generation. So this historical understanding can also sometimes help us think about inclusion in more productive ways. So let's also look at how this history has affected him, right? So maybe along with the love of hard work, along with the love of discipline and learning, he also got computers at a very young age. He got very relevant professional advice, letters of recommendation to apply to institutes, very specific knowledge on which kinds of institutes to apply to, how to apply certain technical textbooks that otherwise people didn't have access to. So these kinds of things which are not easily available to students who are marginalized because they may not know people in positions of power and prestige. right? And also having family members who are in occupations that are socially very valued, like science, engineering, tech, things like that. Of course, or many other examples can also benefit you in certain ways that students from marginalized backgrounds don't have access to. So these are things we can think about. It's important to sort of closely look at inequalities. So now we'll just give a moment's pause, and then what we'll start doing is think about all that we have learned so far and how to apply it in a project that we are going to be designing together. And how to think of various inequalities together, right? So far, we've looked at it one by one. So, how do we think about how all of them could be playing out? Because people could have different combinations. Maybe I'm, a woman, but I'm also, advantaged on the axis of caste. So, there can be different combinations of these things. So, how do we think about that?
Yeah. So now Nidhi and I will try applying whatever we have learned till now, whatever we have discussed till now, to a certain real life setting. Okay, so the setting we have in front of us is that, like, is on digital literacy. So the problem statement we have here is, how do we ensure that disadvantaged students are able to achieve the required digital literacy to aid educational outcomes? By which we mean that, okay, in our day to day now, like in schools or colleges, a lot of the academic work actually consists of activities we have to do online or on computers and smartphones, right? So, but how digital literacy or skills related to using digital applications or softwares are learned is quite unequal. So now Nidhi and I will be a team that is a part of this incubator, and the project we have in front of us is, like, the setting we have in front of us is this, that we've zoomed in on a classroom where a teacher is telling the students Monday is the deadline for the PPT, along with the 500-word write up. You have the weekend, it shouldn't take you too long. And there's this guy saying with ease, yeah, 2 days is more than enough, thank you. And then there's this classmate of his who's thinking, oof, I'm so slow with PowerPoint, typing, research, just everything. Now, this is the situation we have in front of us. So, if we want to understand why this inequality is happening, why the same thing is easier for one student and quite tough for the other, we need to identify maybe certain causes for what is happening, and then maybe we can think of what to do next. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe, we can interview, now that we're building a project, we can interview her and students like her who might be having certain difficulties with digital literacy and sort of see, okay, what are the barriers? What are things that, they need? And yeah, like, I guess that would help also. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good, but I also think that maybe we need to talk to this guy also, right? So to,
Hmm.
like, do whatever is needed to get these skills for digital literacy, maybe we need to understand how does he have what he have, or why is it easier for him. So maybe we can, like, sort of look at the causes for why it is easier for him.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
when
that
we
makes
tried,
sense.
yeah, sorry, when we try doing that, like, sort of, if we interview him, the things might come out, right, about
Yeah.
his past experiences, his background.
Hmm.
So it might, like, his life might look like this. So this is like a
Yeah, let's
behind the scenes for what goes on in his head when he says 2 days is more than enough. Yeah.
let's say that we interviewed him. This is what
Yeah.
we have, yeah, in front of
Yeah.
us. So I noticed that he has a home computer and
Hmm.
high speed internet since childhood.
Yeah.
That stands out to me.
Yeah.
Um,
There's certain markers of identity also that
mm,
tell us how, okay, this is the kind of social group that had access to computers. So he's young, urban, coming from an urban area, and male. So
mm,
he also, like, feels connected to whatever cultures and things we see on the internet, and that is a function of how, say, he had just time to chill around online when he was growing up. So he's had a
yeah,
longer term exposure to internet and digital resources. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to also play online and figure
Yeah.
out what works, what doesn't work. And
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of women, I mean, at least for me, growing up, there was a lot of surveillance online. Maybe a lot of women I know have, shared devices, so maybe they don't get as much time. And also, like, people usually keep an eye on, who you are messaging, and, there's a lot of, it's not unrestricted, like maybe it was for
Yeah.
him, right? What we learn here. Um, he also has a lot of like basic skills that are required even before you get to research, right? So he's
Yeah.
fluent in English, has a certain level of fluency in order to know also what are academic words and keywords that are important to like, research with. He also has basic MS Office skills,
Yeah.
also some experience with doing online research projects. So yeah, that's um these are quite a few keywords that we can use maybe to look at an intervention. So I was thinking, like, what if our intervention could be, at the access level, like, maybe people don't have high speed internet and personal laptop like he does. So what if we give everybody a high speed internet, as well as a personal computer? What do you think? Like, do you think
Yeah.
that works?
Yeah, that sounds good. Like, as a starting point, I think, because like you mentioned, like personal laptop and having a computer is one of the things he had. So maybe others having that would help. But I'm also thinking, like, how do we make up for this like head start he has had, right? Historically. So another student in college might not have that, especially like when we talk about things like research skills and all. So what do you think we should do in that case?
Uh, Maybe we can make some kind of training available to students
Hmm.
who need it, right? So,
Yeah.
where they can learn a little bit of MS Office, but also, to create a PPT, the first step is the research. So maybe a little
Yeah.
bit of research, the curriculum can have,
Hmm.
and also some MS Office, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one thing that will help.
Yeah. I'm also thinking that, yeah, like if so, for example, with students like her, if this sort of training happens, would they feel like a little like singled out or marked in some way, as we were discussing? Like, so if like some students are just selected for this training, it might feel like condescending to them, right? So I think like any training should be careful about that also. And also like, yeah, just teachers themselves should maybe think about this more, or be aware of like different students, like different contexts that students are coming from, and yeah, how it might
Yeah.
affect their, like how long they can take. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, so maybe like a little more personalized training, like, where there's an effort to understand their ideas and, the things they're thinking and their knowledge that already exists, and then work with them to build the
Yeah.
skills. Hmm.
Exactly. Like, yeah, also just, like if teachers have a better understanding of their skills, like we can talk to this teacher also to understand, like, okay, if they know that these are the context students
Hmm.
come from, and then if they've engaged with it, ki, acha,
Right.
do they know what sort of say skills this person has, even if there's a certain lack of familiarity with Microsoft Office, for example.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if that will also increase the burden on a teacher, right? Like teachers we know are overworked already. Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually also going to suggest, like, maybe we can change the assignment, but you're right, like it does increase the burden. Because I was thinking, okay, like, can there be more diverse assessments? Like,
Hmm.
why does it have everybody have to be assessed in the same
Yeah.
way, like in terms of a PowerPoint and a 500 word write-up?
Yeah.
But you're right, like it does add, I mean, teachers also don't a lot of the time have the necessary resources, time, they are also stressed and overworked. But maybe we can talk to this teacher and figure out if some middle ground is possible, so
Yeah.
maybe they don't submit both final drafts on Monday, but get a little more time. Maybe they submit a first
Mhm.
draft on
Yeah.
Monday, and on Wednesday, the teacher can, try and give some generalized feedback to the whole class of what everybody can be doing better, and some resources maybe, and ways to build
Yeah.
on their strengths. And then they can, that so that way it's not too much work for the teacher, but we can also work to like diversify the assessment in some way.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense because, yeah, like you said, it doesn't add to the work, but also makes the process easier for students. But that also reminded me, like, we need to talk to the other students in the class also. Like this guy, for example, he's not saying this to show off or anything, but we need to understand, like, if he knows, say, how skills or experiences are different for his classmates, and so before he says yes, 2 days is more than enough, he can also take into account how different students come from different backgrounds, and if he's speaking for them in some way without understanding their needs or experiences again. Yeah, so that can be
Yeah.
another idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good actually. Maybe we do
Hmm.
like three things. One is, assuming that we win and get all this like funding,
Hmm.
we give personal computers to people, make certain infrastructure possible. We also do some training that is also critical, right? Because I was also thinking about how these ideas of what a PPT needs to look
Hmm.
like, they're very intimidating, right? And the fact
Yeah.
that this boy might unknowingly be the benchmark of how to perform
Yeah.
if he is able to do it with ease, if he's able to do it well, which can be very intimidating, and it can create this like catch up game that you have to always match up to his
Yeah.
performance. But actually we're trying to make things more diverse, even in the way that PPTs look, even in the way that way that we do research, ways that we present the information and things like that. So maybe it can also be a critical kind of training where we say that, okay, these are skills you should know, but you can also like play around with them. Maybe not in certain settings where these standards are, kind of really taken very seriously. But what you want to do and your style of doing this also matters. So that their ideas are also validated, and we're not judging them against this arbitrary standard, right? So that, and yeah, like diversifying assessment practices and sensitization of teachers and students, that sounds good. And I think we've identified the challenges also that we might encounter, and we can be careful about it. What do you think?
Yeah, so like what we also want to say through this, like just switching out of the incubator
Okay.
a little bit now, is that so we Nidhi and I, when we were doing this project or trying to design an intervention, so we were thinking about the method we'll take and the kinds of approaches that we can possibly take while talking to teachers and students and other institutional members. Every intervention that we thought of had a corresponding challenge, right? So it's not like one solution was enough at any point or to even solve a specific problem, right? So this is something like that. What we want to say through this is that inclusion is an ongoing process, and while working through these various questions, like while working through these ideas, there are certain questions you have to keep coming back to. So first is, what are my biases and assumptions? Second, am I observing and listening? And finally, what is missing, right? So something we started with initially also. What is missing is a question we have to keep coming back to, because it's not like inclusion will be achieved and then done with, right? We will have to keep reflecting, revising, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, that's our parting thoughts, and we hope that all of you do really well in the incubator.
Yeah. And if there are any questions, or like, you can, like, if there are any questions you have, you can put them on chat and we can respond to them.
Respond.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you, Rinda. Just so you know, one of the responses on the chat was also that the project can be handwritten. So the students who joined in were also thinking of other ways to make it more accessible. And before we go on to questions, also all students, please do drop in any questions you have pertaining to this theme today. Brinda and Nidhi are here with us for a couple of more minutes, and they'll be able to respond to any thoughts, any comments. So let's take a couple of minutes for that. And I really wanted to say that this journey to understanding that inclusion is a process, that we have hierarchies, that we need to start questioning, that understanding the biases, the challenges in diversity what will help us figure out how to work towards inclusion, and that making that inequality visible, not letting it remain invisible, even though it might not be something that is currently even though it is currently embedded in systems and processes and people's biases and how we implement things on ground. And we need to go back and then start integrating it everywhere. So somebody has to take that onus, and that onus should not fall on the people or the person being excluded. And it cannot remain limited to very basic idea of token inclusion. It has to also focus on the dignity, on, like you mentioned, your style of working. Are you fully integrated? So all of this has, I think, been very helpful. And I'm sure that while the students work on their projects for the incubator, these are questions that they can also start thinking about. And not just if their project is on diversity and inclusion. Any theme that your project is on, these are concepts, these are questions that will add value to how you're thinking, how you're implementing and planning, and how you actually visualize your stakeholders and their interaction with your project. So I will just take a minute to go over the chat. The question that has come in has been, oh, they have other, I'm sorry, I missed out. There were a few other suggestions also that the project can be handwritten. And somebody also mentioned that we don't have budget to give computers. And that is so true, because the budget restrictions are just something common across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of it depends on, we were also suggesting it with the assumption that we have some funding. So yeah, of course, those are restrictions and constraints that you have that you also need to keep in mind. And maybe doing all three things is not possible, right? But the thing to keep in mind is to understand how your own project can be limited and, try and resolve for as much things as possible. But whatever it is not, you kind of understand your own limitations of the project also, I would say.
Also, like to add to what Nidhi and Shubhra said, that it is a very valid constraint, right? The budget. So it will it will become a limitation in your project, understandably. But I think one of the longer term goals can also be identifying what are our demands from institutions or the government, right? That not everything will be addressed at the micro level or at the local level. Engaging with the issues also helps us identify that, okay, we do need an increase in funding for these reasons. So those demands also have to come out from this engagement.
Absolutely, and thank you, Vrinda. I think that's a very important point for all of our incubator students, that what is present and what is available is what we have to start engaging with. But it is also constantly important to remember what questions we want to raise and what are the changes on the macro level that we want to see going forward. Other suggestions on digital infrastructure and funding had also come in. I will quickly take a minute to respond to a technical concern regarding using this video and this session as in the bibliography. And our suggestion, I think, would be that all of Aaina's posts can be found on Instagram. If you are referencing something, the source can be the original content that was being referred to, and going to the source and getting that link and adding that would be more helpful. Beyond this video, also any other content that has been created that actually takes different snippets of material, it's always a good idea to go back and look at the original content before referencing and sourcing it.
Also, just to add to that, on all our posts, we also add references of further readings that will link to other relevant sources that we have actually looked at for developing that post, including, like, for one of the posts, Nidhi mentioned that this is based in research. So that research is also available in the caption, and I'm dropping Aaina's email ID in the comments in case there are any further questions, clarifications, requests for resources. Also, you can write to us.
Thank you, Vrinda. That'll be really helpful. Okay, I think with that, and I would like to thank Nidhi and Vrinda for joining us and sharing this entire set of so many different examples through which in real life we could understand diversity and inclusion. A lot of it, like you shared, was based on education as a space and on Aaina's work. But the thought process and the understanding can translate to whichever theme, whichever project that the students are working on. And we wish you all the best. We will see you tomorrow for the next session. And again, a round of thanks to Nidhi, Vrinda, and everybody else who joined us today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Drishti, we can now end the streaming as well. Rishi, can you confirm?